awesome speakers to kick this thing off. And I will let you know who they are, and then I will stop talking because you did not come to hear me talk. So first up, we have Laura Jacobs. Dr. Laura Jacobs is a citizen of Muskogee Nation and has Choctaw heritage. She is a decolonial complex systems scientist who researches the pathogenic and ecological impacts of outdoor recreation activities on tribal treaty lands. Her publications focus on pathways towards land back through the integration of Indigenous value systems and co-equity-based management paradigms on public lands. Laura is the editor of a forthcoming book called Indigenous Voices, Critical Reflections on Traditional Ecological Knowledge, which contains the voices of over 50 Indigenous peoples from nations and communities around the world who critique and reflect on how TEK is being used and extracted by academics and governmental agencies, and how Indigenous communities are maintaining TEK through decolonized practices. And Laura is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Michigan State University's STEM Ed Pacer Lab, which is an incredible acronym that she might explain what that means. But academics do acronyms well. So Laura, we're really excited to have you. Then we also have James Rattlingleaf with us. James is a global Indigenous consultant and principal of the Wolakota Lab, who serves as a guide and inspiration to organizations to work more effectively with Indigenous peoples for a more equitable world. He has over 25 years working with the US federal government, higher education institutions, and nonprofits to develop and maintain relationships with federally and non-federally recognized American Indian tribes, tribal colleges and universities, and tribal communities. James specializes in developing programs that interface between Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and Western science. He sees a greater vision of human knowledge that incorporates the many insights of human cultures and provides context for our better understanding of the planet and the world. James is currently involved with in projects, a whole bunch of projects, among them, some with the Environmental Science Data Innovation and Inclusion Lab, the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, GEO Indigenous Alliance, and the Ecological Society of America's Governing Board of Directors. He's a citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe and has a degree from Sente Gleshka University. And then Todd Mitchell is joining us. Todd is a Swinomish tribal citizen and the environmental director of the Swinomish Department of Environmental Protection with the Swinomish tribal community. His work while employed by the tribe has been focused on the protection and enhancement of the reservation's water resources and water-dependent natural resources. That work includes research activities in traditional ecological knowledge and culturally used wetland plants, tidelands, surface water, groundwater, salmon habitat, and restoration projects to advance tribal natural resource goals. Todd initiated the tribe's ongoing Between Two Worlds Indigenous Science High School class to teach tribal youth about the science the DP is engaged in, and helps oversee a number of co-equity-based management agreements with the state of Washington. So that is who is talking to us. And we are going to start off with Laura. And you have all been made co-hosts. So Laura, if you want to share your screen, you can go right ahead.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can get this. There we go. Okay. Hesje Laura Jacobs, Chohojifkidos, Muskogee Marayes, Ecological Gidoyes, Chaptasia Hoki, Estongon Chakaidega. Hi everyone, my name is Laura Jacobs. I'm a citizen of Muskogee Creek Nation. I also have Choctaw heritage. I'm in the Potato Clan of my tribe. My people came from Coweta Tribal Town, which was situated on the banks of the Chattahoochee River before we were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. Adam gave me a really great introduction, so we're going to skip over some of this slide here. A couple things that weren't in that introduction that I didn't send to him previously are that I do a lot of work with Indigenous land management paradigms, specifically focused on land back and co-equity based management. I'm also leading a national report right now on the status of tribes and climate change It's the second volume of this report, and it's focused inherently on Indigenous-led conservation. And I think we have 43 authors on it. So it's a pretty big report, and we're excited to have that published next year. I'm also a Michigan State University postdoc, and I put the acronym in the chat, and I have to cheat and go look and see what the acronym means because I don't really remember sometimes. But it's participatory action, community-based research, something like that. And it's all with Indigenous communities, but focused on STEM education. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my forthcoming book, just kind of as an introduction to traditional ecological knowledge. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the intersections of traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science in the realm of land management. So my forthcoming book is called Indigenous Voices, Critical Reflections on Traditional Ecological Knowledge. I think it's going to be published sometime late next year in the fall or in the winter. This book is very interesting because it centers only Indigenous voices. We have only Indigenous authors, only Indigenous peer reviewers, and I'm the editor of the volume, so, an Indigenous editor in there. There's 54 Indigenous peoples from 52 different Indigenous communities on a pretty much global scale. We didn't get people from every continent, but we got most continents in here. Like North America, we have Indigenous folks from Central America, we have Pacific Islanders, people from Africa, New Zealand, Japan, Siberia, just really a wide array of voices. Now, the book is premised on this ongoing problem where Indigenous communities are facing and have been facing pressures to braid our knowledges with Western science in colonial, governmental, and academic contexts. And this has been going on for a couple decades now, which kind of bookends a long history of people saying Indigenous knowledges aren't science, they're not valid, and things like that. But the problem today is that Indigenous voices are often really missing in the cultural landscape of academic and governmental objectives that are directed at researching, using, and extracting our knowledges. And so Indigenous leadership hasn't really been maintained as part of that discussion. So the book has an inherent decolonial focus that privileges Indigenous people's perspectives, our practices, and our knowledges pertaining to our sacred knowledges, right? Like traditional ecological knowledge, which is inherently a sacred form of knowing, and how our knowledges are used and harvested and extracted by researchers and governments. But we're also trying to understand with this book how our communities are using our knowledge systems in sovereign ways that deserve protection and oversight by tribal nations, which is inherently data sovereignty. So the book centers Indigenous voices and it focuses on traditional ecological knowledge, but it's divided into 3 different sections, which are 3 distinct Indigenous value systems that are pretty much shared across the globe by Indigenous peoples: relationships, responsibility, and reciprocity. And this book focuses on how we can decolonize how we understand traditional ecological at large by centering Indigenous peoples' understandings of it. And it addresses what's happening in Indigenous communities with traditional ecological knowledge. Now, for those who don't really know what traditional ecological knowledge is, it's not just a knowledge system. Traditional ecological knowledge arises out of native sciences or Indigenous sciences, which are incorporated into larger Indigenous knowledge systems. And if you trace back the roots of the term TEK, this is a Western scientific term. If you go into my community and you talk to my elders and you say, can you tell me about your TEK? They're going to look at you and go, what are you talking about? It was created by settler scientists who really needed to understand and have a term to describe Indigenous ways of being, or what traditional ecological knowledge really is, which is a knowledge, belief, practice system. So the word is a little confusing because it's not just about knowledges, it's this incorporation of all 3 of those factors. So traditional ecological knowledge underscores how Indigenous peoples have cultivated and passed down generationally our knowledges since time immemorial, and how we do that to understand our local place-based environments. So it's very specific to people, culturally specific, and very specific to certain ecosystems. It's also a valid form of science. So it's scientific information that originates from our lived and storied participations that we have with our local ecosystems. And like I said, it's not just a knowledge system. It incorporates our stories, our ceremonies, our prayers, our cosmologies, our value systems, our knowledges, of course, but also our ways of being, our worldviews, and our languages. And the data that comes from traditional ecological knowledge is often stored within our elders and our ceremonial practitioners, who are the living oral libraries for our communities. So what does all of this have to do with public land management? So before we kind of intersect with TEK with public land management, one thing I always want people to understand is that we can't talk about public land management without discussing the histories of Indigenous peoples and the land, animal, water, and plant dispossessions that are really deeply tied within the framework of how this country established our public land management agencies, but also, it's still ongoing today, a lot of these issues. So if we think about these things through like an Indigenous lens, and we want to rewind time a little bit and talk about US history, many Indigenous peoples look at the United States in different contexts. Before the United States was established, Indigenous people stewarded these lands since time immemorial. These are all still Indigenous lands today, and you'll hear Indigenous people say that these are still our lands. And when we look at the United States history, we recognize a state that was founded on settler colonialism, that has policies about land occupancy and policies that uphold white supremacy, policies that led to the slavery of Black and Indigenous peoples, and of course, Indigenous land dispossessions, even in the context of the creation of parks and protected areas. And most importantly, we've had policies that led to the largest genocide in global history, which was the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Yellowstone was created in 1872, and since then, you can see these maps here. These are maps of federal land management areas all around the nation. The feds own a lot of land. They manage a ton of lands, and that's about 640 million land acres today. So, comparison of the map, the feds have a lot of our lands in their power, in their wheelhouse of control. We often refer to national parks as America's best idea, which is ironic for a lot of Native folks, because we see national parks as created, that were created as tools of dispossession, where we were forcibly removed from our homelands so that they could be created, where we're still in many ways forbidden to access our lands, our plants, our waters, and our animals and our cultural sites, because these parks and protected areas are still occupying our lands, and they maintain many different barriers for us to access our traditional resources, specifically through really difficult permitting processes where we have to turn over our knowledges and let them extract those from us before they give us permission. When we think about natural resource management in the context of the United States and Indigenous nations, lots of people talk about how Indigenous perspectives are incorporated into these processes, but it's important to realize that there is no uniform policy that exists across the federal government for tribal consultation. We do have the Constitution, of course, which grants Congress exclusive power to handle matters related to tribal nations and tribal treaties. And it also acknowledges a government-to-government relationship, which establishes tribes as sovereign nations. If we look at tribal consultation policies, and I have a chapter in my book where I do this, it was actually from my dissertation, we can look at the long history of tribal consultation and trace it back to at least 1781. But tribal consultation processes have been historically and are currently pretty harmful and can be extractive to Indigenous peoples. And even tribal consultation processes that we've seen historically have ended up or resulted in the forced removals of Indigenous peoples off of their lands. And even these permit processes that I was just mentioning a second ago, just for us to gain access to them today. It's also important when you're thinking about natural resource management and federal consultation policies to understand that the federal government does recognize the benefits of cooperative conservation with tribal governments, and they follow their tribal consultation policies, but these policies only see tribes as stakeholders and not necessarily as rights holders. So that there's kind of this pushback going on between tribal sovereignty and then the federal government saying, we want to talk to you about things, and tribes are saying, but we have rights and we want these things to happen instead. federal land management agencies actually have no legal responsibility to enact tribal input. So even when tribes are sitting at the table giving their feedback, land managers don't actually have to use that feedback in any generative way. And tribes often report that tribal consultation takes place often after parks and protected areas have already made managerial decisions. So it's more of like this checkmark task. And for many tribes, we've heard that consultation is basically just a sounding board process with no actual benefits to tribal entities. And I think the most important thing when we think about tribal consultation is that stakeholder consultation approaches do not equal tribal consent of how managerial practices are actually going on. In a recreation framework, this is something that a lot of people don't know about, but federal lands, when they're managed for visitation or public use, all federal agencies use what's called the Interagency Visitor Use Management Framework. And it's this little diagram on the side that's really concise, but it's a huge giant document if you go and you read about it. And so this process is for managers to use when they make visitor use and management decisions. There were no tribes involved in creating this framework. There was no tribal consultation that occurred. It considers tribes, again, as stakeholders instead of as right holders, which always makes me pause and consider whose perspectives and knowledges are actually included in these processes and whose are prioritized, especially when tribes are looked at as stakeholders and put on the same equal plane as nonprofits and other members of the general public, instead of as sovereign entities that have treaty rights. So the Interagency Visitor Use Management Framework really disregards tribal sovereignty and our relations, our responsibilities, and our histories with our lands. But even more problematic, it doesn't provide any pathways for Indigenous leadership and our values to guide the processes of land management, which isn't inherent to how Indigenous people steward our lands. Further problematic is there's really little room, if any, for how Indigenous knowledges can actually be incorporated into these managerial processes in ways that are not extractive. And, a lot of that comes down to the fact that the power and control of all of these things are still situated with the federal government, and tribes are still looked at as, just on this plane with the general public as stakeholders. Now, in 2021, the White House did some magnificent things. They issued this memo on what they call Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. TEK, by the way, is inherently Indigenous, so the I is a little weird on that. But they recognized for the very first time in history that Indigenous knowledge is an important way of knowing, and that traditional ecological knowledge is a valid form of science. So this was very monumental to see from the federal government. In that document, they committed to advancing relations between the feds and tribal nations by creating different policies that would incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into federal decision-making processes. And then they went for about a year and they did these public listening sessions, and they wanted to solicit feedback from tribes and Indigenous communities. I went out and I actually participated in one and gave them my feedback. And then I worked with the White House, and I actually facilitated and moderated one of these national listening sessions, which gave me the opportunity to listen to other Indigenous peoples from around the United States and hear their concerns about our Indigenous knowledges and about what it means when the government wants to create these types of policies. In 2022, there was a new memo that was released by the federal government, and it had policies that were created for federal government agencies to include traditional ecological knowledge. And honestly, historically, this provided an extreme transformation of public policy that really does prioritize tribes. And I don't want to minimize that. It is monumental legislation, but it looks amazing. It looks amazing on paper, but there's a lot of problems with it when you start getting into the weeds of it. The first problem that I see is that it doesn't provide any guarantee for Indigenous data sovereignty. And that's really because of all these other things that are going on, all these other policies and acts in the federal government that we have behind the scenes, like the Freedom of Information Act. So when a tribe is working with the National Park Service or a different federal land management agency, someone from the general public can go and and, put in a FOIA release of information and then get all of that data. So that's not really going to guarantee Indigenous data sovereignty through that process. There's also interagency information sharing needs. So the Department of Interior oversees most of, not all, but most of our public land management agencies. And if you're a tribe and you're working with, let's say, the National Park Service again, and let's say Fish and Wildlife Service is interested in that project, anytime there is an interagency information need, that other department can source that information that's from the other project, from the other entity. And what that does is that it precludes tribal oversight of data, and tribes may not be aware that their data is being shared with other agencies without their permission. So again, it's not regarding the importance of data sovereignty for tribal nations. There's also issues with federal funding and new mandates that require anyone who's receiving federal funding for specific projects to make that data publicly available. So what does that mean for sovereign tribal nations who have the implicit right to govern and oversee their data in ways that protect their rights, when all of these things can be happening in the background out of their purview? Another issue with the new memo is that there's still this settler control and governance going on. And if you read the documents, and I think the memo, the new policy thing was like 40 some odd pages, it's not that long, but there's this embedded understanding that the federal government can apply traditional ecological knowledge without tribal oversight. And if you remember the definition of traditional ecological knowledge and all of the things that it encompasses, it's bizarre. Like, the understanding is very bizarre to me. And it's a big no for me, because only Indigenous peoples can apply traditional ecological knowledge, because it incorporates so much of who we are: our languages, our cultures, our ceremonies, our prayers, our cosmologies, our origin stories. It is not just this checklist that we can hand over and say, this is how you do this, and then the federal government can go do it without us. And so there's this very weird misinterpretation of what TEK actually is. But even further problematic, there's no park and protected area frameworks that exist right now that can even support these new policies. How do we incorporate Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge into parks and protected area management without frameworks that are in place for that to be done, which guarantee data sovereignty, which guarantee that Indigenous peoples' values and management and leadership can be part of these processes? So while the federal government is making some monumental, historic decisions with their policies, it's almost they're putting the cart before the horse, right? Where we don't have the frameworks in place to make this as safe as it can be for tribal entities. So when I think about these things, and I think about traditional ecological knowledge and natural resource management, all the problems with parks and protected areas, it always leads me to the same types of solutions, that we really need a paradigm shift where we're looking more at how tribal land management can help provide this framework for public land entities in this country that is more generative to Indigenous people's rights. So, and when I say tribal land management, I'm talking about co-equity based management, where Indigenous nations and the feds might be sharing equally powers to manage different resources and lands. And that doesn't mean that, like how the federal government describes co-management, it's more of this collaborative process. I'm talking about like actual sharing in an equitable framework of power, so that tribes don't have to turn over their TEK so they can protect it, so that they can manage through their own worldviews. And that kind of framework will lead us into positions later on where we can get back into land back management. But both of these kind of tribal land management paradigms here prioritize Indigenous people's needs, our responsibilities, our values, the ways that we have historically and currently manage our lands. They prioritize our knowledges, and specifically they prioritize data sovereignty, which is important. And, when we start thinking about these paradigms, they allow us to pave the way toward land back and help us to start rectifying some of the harms of over 500 years of colonization. So yeah, that's what I got.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Laura. Appreciate it. That was a great overview. And I think we'll have James go next. James, who's been in a lot of these meetings with groups trying to hammer out these details that Laura was talking about.
Well, good morning again, everybody, and thank you, Adam. You did a good job on pronouncing Santa Ecological University, so we're off to a good start. Again, I have mentioned I am from the Roden Sioux tribe, and so I'm based in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And as in my introduction, you know, I find myself in really interesting places now. I've been working 25 years, you know, at a travel college, really trying to advance travel nation building. Really looking at these issues of capacity development, you know, for our communities and for our travel students. But today I find myself really, you know, working with universities, working with the federal government, nonprofits, and now that we see these opportunities as Laura shared. That was a great presentation, Laura. That was pretty awesome. For my remarks, I just want to say that I'll just share some things I'm involved in now, and if we're going to do question and answer, that's great. I'm better at that. But a couple of things I wanted to highlight. First of all is I, as well as several other Indigenous leaders, were part of the new Department of Interior Elevating TK into Federal Decision-Making Handbook and Training Program. And so now we have a draft of a handbook that's going to really inform all the DOI employees on how they elevate TK. And so that was an interesting process, just to listen and be part of those discussions, how the government is doing. Basically, they really don't know how to do it. That's the bottom line. The government does not know how to do that. And so to me is how we're going to do it then. What's going to be an implementation of this handbook, the major concepts as Laura outlined, but also how we're going to train and elevate and work with employees right now. And so so we recommended a number of things in the handbook. It's not out yet. It's still under review. But again, I think it's a step. It's not a perfect handbook, and nothing is. But I think that at least the people I worked with in this team of Indigenous scholars felt that we were on a good track. I shared this with Indigenous leaders as well. I told them what I was doing with this handbook, and I asked their opinion on it, and they said it's a good start. It's a good step. And so I think the other part of it is that we have to be involved. And again, I credit this administration for really putting and placing a lot of Indigenous leadership in key government positions. That's never happened before. So I think that's another positive step. We have leadership in those key positions where I think where decisions are made, or, you know, as policies are being developed, we really have a good leadership there, good knowledge there, and good wisdom there. The other part I would say too is the role of tribes and travel colleges. I come from a travel college system myself. I graduated there, worked there for 8 years at Santa Ecological. And if you really want to think about, you know, what works in Indian country, take a look at how travel colleges are addressing, how approaching science, how approaching those issues that Laura talked about, really at the community level. So it's important for me to advocate for travel colleges, and I'll do it again today. The 35 across this country, they do a great job in preparing Indigenous people for the future. And I know that I'm a graduate of that, but also I work there, and I think that's important. The other part I also want to highlight too is, you know, in my role, I serve as a liaison for a new data synthesis center at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm excited about this work because really for the first time, we have a national synthesis center funded by the National Science Foundation, $22 million for the next 5 years, really to think about building, for instance, these policies, these practices that Laura talked about with data sovereignty. That's a big deal. So if anything, takeaway is the importance of travel data sovereignty and how that conflicts with open data, open science. And so we have, at least as I see it, we have this conflict right now in terms of how we work with data and how we work with that, and the importance of that, at least to TK. I think in that work also with the Data Synthesis Center is really trying to advocate to the National Science Foundation about these important matters of data sovereignty and how we do that. The other thing I want to share is that the role of climate. You see the parks, talk about parks. I'm also working on the USGS Biodiversity and Climate Assessment. That's a North American scale assessment, and where Mexico, Canada, the United States are working together, these assessments to understand again what are the key issues, and myself and other Indigenous scholars are part of that work again, what role does TK play in these national assessments? So we have the National Climate Assessment coming out, we have the Nature Assessment that's rolling down, and now we have this USGS. Do they all work together? Do they all talk together? Do they all client? Well, that's to be, I don't know, not really, maybe, but that's these things are happening, and increasingly the concept, the talk of TK is all part of that. I also want to share that, you know, in all this work, I think that the role of universities is a key part of this as well. And I think as Indigenous people, you know, we have to be at the table. And so in my work, you know, I get to be a part of a science organization. So I have this something called, I know Laura talked about braided. So I have this braided identity in my work, a braided identity where I'm connected, I'm a part of an Indigenous nation, but also I sit as a science organization like University of Colorado Boulder. Series is another word. I do love acronyms. I'm still not decolonized yet. I do love acronyms because if I had to say series again and again and again, it's the Cooperative Institute for Environmental Science Research. Can you imagine saying that like in a meeting or a conference? So I'm not there yet, Laura, but you could still have hope for me. But I'm serving as a travel advisor. I'm getting interviewed by the Denver Post today, later this afternoon, on this new role at Ceres. And I think one of the things that has to happen is the creation of these things called boundary spanners. And Indigenous people who have this identity, a braided identity, who have this connection to their community, but also have the wherewithal, have the knowledge and experience and the education to sit in these places like science organizations, like assessments, where decisions are being made about our future as Indigenous people. I think these roles are important, and so I get to be the inaugural one at Ceres, with the hope that the university and our work is going to benefit Indigenous people in particular. That's my goal, and if Ceres benefits, then that's great too. But again, I'm thinking about the next generation, and I'm really glad that Laura talked about those 3 R's: the relationships, the reciprocity, and responsibility. You know, this work is not just for me, it's just not a job. So Adam made the point that I'm doing a lot of things. Well, it's right now, we just find the work is there for us. Never in my career have I had so many opportunities to speak and to be part of things like things I've just shared. So it's important that we as Indigenous people, and we know this, we have a responsibility to this work, to the land and to the environment and to the future. So I would say, again, as a journalist, you know, there are a lot of Indigenous people doing good work out there. They're there and they're doing great work. You don't see them, there's not a lot of fanfare around their work, but they're doing good work. And I think that, you know, for the first time again in history, if I see it, you know, we're having these opportunities, and I think that our voices matter. Legitimate voices matter. And the other thing I would say too, and it's a little controversial, but I'll end with this, is the role of identity. The role of Indigenous identity. And if you, as news reporter, you should know the story about Buffy St. Marie, the reclaimed Indigenous musician activist there in Canada. And so, you know, her identity was in question. And to me, it's not so much her identity is in question, it's really about authenticity of Indigenous people. For so long, we've been co-opted by other people to tell our own story. And so I think that you have to do your due diligence in finding those voices that will bring authenticity to these issues. Because what happens is you have these voices that don't represent Indigenous people, don't represent our communities, and then you're doing a disservice to us now and in the future. So I'm going to say that I think authenticity matters. I think obviously voices matter, and I think that it's important that you know that, and because again, you're just continuing this process of colonizing our voices and ourselves. So my last point will be with parks. I'm really glad that we talked about parks. I'm in South Dakota. One of our paramount sacred sites is something called the Wind Cave National Park. You may have been there. It's an important place to Lakota people in our creation story. And so, well, as part of a project to facilitate and co-facilitate a consultation meeting with tribes, 16 tribes have a vested interest in Wind Cave. So it's just not one tribe you're going to deal with. You're going to have multiple tribes that have multiple connections to places, and their stories also interlap as well. So to understand that, requires a complex thinking, complex preparation, so that you're getting the full story about these places. And so Wind Cave was a great example of, again, for me, as I learned to do this work more and more, the importance of how you bring tribal nations to the table. So that means engagement, having a foresight to understand how you do tribal engagement, whether it's at the individual level, as a tribal member, as a nation level. So I think those are key understandings that you have to have, to reflect the voices that need to be said and need to be heard. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much, James. And yeah, hopefully we can help do our small part into getting those voices you're talking about in front of groups of journalists. So, all right, Todd, you are last up here, and then we will get to Q&A. And if you want to share your screen, you can. If not, you can just go.
Great. Hathawale, Todd Mitchell, Swadaps. Good afternoon or good day. My name is Todd Mitchell. My traditional name is Swalatum. I'm Swinomish. And yeah, I'll kind of put all these things together and to some work that we've done at Swinomish, kind of practical application of this work right on our reservation. So let me see. Yeah, I got a few slides, but this is a pared down version of presentation we gave to Washington State Parks last year. So about as fast as I can go through like a half an hour presentation in a few minutes. So this is relating to Kukutali Preserve, co-managing the first tribal state park in Washington, and we think even in the nation. So this started back in 2010, and a little bit of background. I'm clicking on the right thing. Can you see my slideshow, right? Forward. There we go, forward.
Yep, it's going.
Okay, so the Swinomish Reservation is in kind of the northern Puget Sound area, kind of the middle of the Salish Sea, kind of where Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, and Strait of San Juan's come together. So Kukutali Preserve is on the western part of the reservation. It's kind of this island connected to the main part of the reservation, encompassing about 93 acres of uplands and about 38 or so acres of tribal tidelands surrounding it. And kind of the history of this area, really quick. So the tribe was under the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855. So all of the reservation was under overall tribal ownership during that time. That changed with basically the Allotment Act in 1877, where the reservation, like many others, were checkerboarded into smaller parcels, and direct ownership was given to specific tribal people or families. And they were able to use the land, live on the land, or sell the land as they wished. And so that happened to this area. The Alati sold that land to a bunch of developers in the 1920s. They didn't really develop it except for a couple houses and not a whole bunch of houses, luckily. One of the owners bought the rest out in the 40s, built another house out there. So there's two houses out there. Then the whole thing was sold in 1969 to Seattle City Light. And their big idea, amongst others, around Skagit Valley was to research it for building a nuclear power plant. Of course, there was various oppositions, and actually no power plants were built in the Skagit Valley, luckily. And they sold it off to another fee landowner, who eventually sold it to a consortium of grantors, including the tribe, state parks, in 2010. So that's where this all kind of starts. So it's kind of like, this is really cyclical kind of thing of like, it went out a tribal ownership and eventually came back. Well, came back partially. So the work we do really stands on top of our tribal leaders and our legal leaders in getting this agreement with state parks together, where it's really an innovative partnership of co-owning and co-managing the entire preserve. So one thing that the state parks affirmed was that the tideland around the preserve were tribal tidelands. That was always a point of contention during all of the sales, that the tidelands went with the uplands, but they never did. So really, this is kind of a story of reaffirming what the tribe always owned, bringing the uplands back into tribal ownership, and restoring our tribal access to this area. Since all during that time when it was out of tribal ownership, tribal people really couldn't go out there to the uplands or really even utilize the tidelands, including the tideland resources. So the opening, yeah, it was a great celebration. There was a lot of people out there, a lot of my elders and mentors. First time they were able to go out there ever, or very rarely. So, or go out there legally, I guess. So it was great to get all these people out there and just see the area that they haven't been able to see for a long time. So this was so long ago that, yeah, the bottom picture is my kids way back in the day when they were a lot smaller. So their first time out there also. We've been back there many times since. So one of the things, so I've been on, so the part of this work was developing a co-management board so that the board would implement the co-management agreement for the tribe and state parks. So I've been on the co-management board since the beginning, first as an alternate and then as a regular member. So we have 3 members from the tribe and 3 members from state parks. I think we bumped that up to 4 each now. And we've been meeting quarterly since 2010 to talk about how we co-manage this area. So really our first work out there was to figure out how to get it ready as a park, since it was just basically a private island and private residence. It took a lot of time to think about exactly what was the access we wanted out there, and how we wanted to manage that. But along the way also, Kukatali is a traditional name. So it comes from the meaning place of cattail mats. So one of these indigenous knowledges that we have is cattail mats were kind of utilitarian things that people used for kind of like windscreens or temporary shelters. Even used it for bedding. I actually have a cattail mat from my dad, which he used as a youth as basically like a traditional thermarest. I mean, it's squishy, so it's pretty cool. So one of the things, I said is like, it wasn't always called, it was called that, but that name was lost for such a long time. So I knew it had a traditional name. So being on the board, I'm like, this place had a traditional name and we should use it. So I brought it up and the board adopted it. And part of that too was like, hey, it has a meaning and we should probably come up with a logo. And they're like, okay, go do it. And I'm like, okay, I'll think about it. So that's where the logo comes from. It is a representation of a cattail mat creaser, which is used in helping make cattail mats. So cattails are really long leaves that grow in wetlands. So they have to figure out how to sew them together. So more of a representation. So one of my pandemic projects was actually carve one. So I'll stop sharing quick. Actually carve one. Because it's kind of hard to tell from the diagram what it is, because it's a handle. So and it has a groove on the bottom, which makes grooves to help sew them together. So it's hard to show really quickly, but I thought it was kind of fun. It's like, you know what, I'm gonna spend some time and make one. So that I have to explain every single detail every single time, even though I still do anyway. Um, so, um, so getting back to, so since I'm a scientist, also, part of the work we were charged with, I didn't actually start the slideshow, so you can see all the slides. Anyways, one of the things we did was, to open the reserve, we wanted to do a whole bunch of scientific studies, baseline studies, status surveys, what do you want to call them, to understand the nature of nature in the preserve, to figure out what was importance out there, what kind of things were growing, what kind of things were there that needed special protections, as well as using background information from our elders, because the road that connects the main part of the reservation to Kukatali is an elevated road that was built on tidelands. So we spent a lot of time doing a lot of nearshore studies to understand how that affected the sediment transport in the area, and eventually recommended restoration of that area, of basically removing the road so that the tides could go across that area like they did naturally. So I actually knew one of the elders that lived right by this area. So I went and talked with them, and she said, yes, I used to go across to Kukatali when she was a youth. And you have to go when it wasn't high tide, otherwise you get stuck on either side. And she even said when she was a youth, she went across one time and lost her shoe. She got stuck in the mud, couldn't find it, and had to keep going because the tide was coming in. So, I mean, that was one of the things that I could bring, to our leadership of both sides of both the tribe and state parks, to say, this is the way it used to be. We don't have a need to drive out there anymore. So I recommend that we restore this area. So that's what we eventually did based on bringing all these studies together. So it's really a, exercise in tribally led research leading towards we have, let's see, what's your stewardship management plan, which was incorporated into the conservation management plan, which was further incorporated into the preserve's master management plan in whole. So we took all of our studies, that was all tribally and indigenous led, straight into recommendations for management and restoration of the park. And that was adopted in whole. So we were able to bring, our resources in the scientific realm and the planning realm to really lead the way in developing the master management plan. So Parks was able to bring their knowledge in how to develop and manage a park. So I think that was a great partnership. And it was like, we didn't know how to run a park. They did. They didn't have the scientific background or the resources to do all the studies, but we did. So I think, it all came together really great. So yeah, master management plan, a lot of development out there. So all we had to do is some small things, trails, some restrooms, and then doing the restoration. So here's the before and after. So yeah, it was a really high elevated road, and taking it out just allowed the natural processes to resume. Sediment, water, and driftwood transport across this area. So that led great into our fisheries department in using a site on the other side of the island for developing clam garden, one of the first brought back in the US for a long time. So it's kind of an in progress picture. I can't remember when, from last year. So just allowing us to, do resource protection, resource development on our reservation right nearby, so that, we can really feel and make this place our own, since it had been out of tribal ownership for generations. So with that, I think I'll end, and yeah, hopefully that was helpful in showing some work and practice, on the ground.
Yeah, thanks so much, Todd. That was great. And that really showed, Laura told me I had to reach out to you because you're working on what she sees as one of the few successful co-management systems there. So it was great to get to see some of it. So folks, if you don't mind turning your cameras back on so our speakers can see they're talking to a room full of people, we're going to have Q&A. And the way this works is you let me know you have a question by just saying so in the chat bar, and I will call on you as they come. So if anyone wants to kick off with the first question, just let me know in the chat bar, and you do not need to type out the entirety of your question. I will let you ask it yourself. But this way I can call on people in order. And we have Bellamy up first. And she has lots of questions.
Always.
Short ones. But right now you're the only one, so go for it.
Okay, well, I'll start with Todd since we're in the same general vicinity. And I wish I had met you in person before, Todd. I'm with KX, Tacoma, Seattle. And I'm aware of the clam garden story, but I hadn't heard the full story of the park restoration. So that makes me want to revisit it in that way. I'm wondering if there was a renaming that had to happen of the land when you call it Kukatali. Like, there's been so many renamings. So are there sort of, colonizer names on that land that are being changed, or how is that working?
Yeah, that's one of I think there's we have two names. I think there's the little islandette on the very end has its own name. I forget what it is now because we haven't really brought that one back to regular use. It's called Flagstaff. It's basically the indigenous version of Flagstaff,
And
or a traditional version of Flagstaff. But yeah, the main part of the island that was called Kickett Island, and our archivist actually found that it was named by one of the explorers that came through in the 18 whatever, the USXX exploration. And somehow, yeah, they named it Kickett because it was close. It was kind of close. But I think she said it, was a name from a California name, California indigenous name. So it's like, that's kind of weird, but maybe they just came from California and that's, you're like, hey, that sounds good. But I don't think there's much we needed to do in renaming it. We're just like, well, this is what the name is, so that's what it is. So yeah, Kukatali Preserve is actually I forget what you call it, like a subunit of Deception Pass State Park. So it's managed by state parks through Deception Pass.
Got it. And it's Kukatali. Did I say that more or less?
Kukatali, yep.
Kukatali. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll be pestering you later for follow-ups if it's okay.
Yeah, so yeah, basically that, the slideshow that we gave at state parks, that was a shortened version of it. But yeah, we have a longer version. I actually have a longer version of it than the one we gave at state parks, which yeah, we hope to turn into some sort of article or paper that we can put somewhere. We just haven't had the time to get to it because we're kind of busy doing all of the other scientific research on the reservation.
I understand. I imagine there are channels to work through, ask for ways of, helping to tell that story. So I'll be following up.
Yeah, but I think it's true for, a lot of our tribes and a lot of our, the scientific people that work in our tribes. Like we're so busy trying to do so many things that, we do one thing, we get it done, it helps our community, and we go on to the next thing, and we have the story internal to ourselves or internal to our community, but we don't have that story external to various places. So we don't really have time to rectify that a lot of times, but we try and work on that very slowly of like, because I think, in my bio, I say I work also on traditional used and culturally used plants. And we hope to have actually, the first article out maybe next year but that's one article over the life of a 25-year project. So
Yeah.
we're too busy doing the project and, get it out there in the academic kind of world or the journal kind of world because, we're doing the work.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. I'll be quiet now so someone else can ask.
All right, thanks, Bellamy. Haley, you had a question. Haley, we can't hear you. It says you're unmuted, but we're not hearing you. I was even gonna say how we made through introductions and there was no muting problems. All right, we'll let Haley work on audio, and Sporty, you go ahead and ask your question and we'll get back to Haley.
Thanks, Adam. So I had a question for Todd, I was just curious. I think it's been a decade of you working in this partnership to build the preserve. So what is the current status like? Is the preserve like well and functioning? And you showed the photos of clam gardens, etc. So are there any research programs that are underway in the preserve, or what's the status? I was just curious.
The status of the what?
Sorry?
The status of the what?
Of the preserve right now. So is that something, are there like research activities underway there, or what's happening since the time you started?
Yeah, I think the big lift was us getting it ready for full public opening. So I think we did that in 2016, where we got all the amenities in place, including a little teeny tiny parking lot, along with the outdoor vault toilets. So since then, it's been easy because the big lift was getting it ready so the public could get out there, and then responding to minor kind of stuff since then about access or off-trail use. So since then, since the tidelands around the preserve are wholly tribal, that allows the tribe to bring forth projects that meet our own needs and goals. So hence the restoration of the road that was wholly on tribal tidelands. We still work with the parks to say this is what we're looking to do. Still get some consensus on it, even though we didn't totally need to. As well as the clam garden, we our fisheries department has brought that along to the board, and as still trying to bring them up to speed on what they're doing, get some consensus on it, even though the tribe really doesn't need to either.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. And Sporty, we'll come back around to you after Haley and Michelle here. Haley, can we hear you now?
Can you hear me now?
You can.
Excellent. Okay, love it. Thanks for your patience. Really great presentations. Thanks so much for everybody's time. I did have a question that it kind of came to me when Laura was speaking, but I would be really interested to hear answers from all three of the speakers. But Laura, in your presentation, you talked a bit about the idea of like data sovereignty and how previous relationships sometimes have been exploitive. And I do wonder occasionally as a journalist about being extractive, that I come to a community that I'm not a part of, and I want to share a story, and I interview people, and then I take that back and publish it in a particular article. And I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the idea that like some things are private, or sovereignty is important, or getting permission to share things is important? Could you talk a bit about that, like help explain to me, why that's important, and also how to navigate that as a journalist, if you have ideas for how to be respectful and not rude when asking for knowledge, or how to be reciprocal, I guess, and not extractive.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions that are, and
Sorry.
each one of them, no, all of them are very important, and I wish more people would ask these questions. I think the best way to start with this is to acknowledge I'm a citizen of my tribe. I'm not a spokesperson for my tribe. I am not a vetted speaker for my tribe. So there's a distinction when you're speaking to Indigenous peoples versus speaking to their communities, or having a person who is speaking on behalf of their government. Todd works for his government. Todd is a vetted speaker for his government, right? So when you're thinking about people, especially in journalism and like when you're writing articles and you're thinking about who you want to interview, the first question you need to ask yourself, what kind of voice are you wanting to bring to that table? Do you need a specific Indigenous person's perspective? Do you want a tribal perspective? And then when we think about like data sovereignty in that, when you opt to go for a tribal perspective and you're talking to a tribal government or whoever their vetted speakers are, that's where data sovereignty really comes into play more than just me sitting up here saying whatever I want to say, right? Because I'm not speaking on behalf of my tribe. So the tribe will know exactly what they can and cannot say. Like Todd, I bet there's a billion other stories about this magnificent park that he has up there that he's not going to share because of data sovereignty. And like when he publishes his paper that, Todd, I'm still waiting on that paper. I need to cite it. I keep writing papers and I need to cite your stuff. Like whenever he does that, usually there's processes in the background where you have to go through tribal review processes. Sometimes they include attorneys looking over things. Tribal council can sometimes come in there, but a tribally vetted speaker already is aware of what they can and cannot speak about. And I would opt for those people most of the time whenever you're doing reporting, unless you're wanting to go to like a scientist who's speaking about their specific work. One thing as an academic that I can say that I see what happens a lot is that you'll have a lot of non-Indigenous academics working with tribal communities, and then they think they can speak for those tribal communities. I would never do that. Like I would never go to the academic. I would go to the tribe and speak to the tribe, because that person doesn't always have permission or know that they need permission to speak on behalf of the tribe. And usually they can't speak on behalf of the tribe because of sovereignty. Okay, so the other part of that question was like what else people can do, what you can consider, right, when you're speaking to Indigenous peoples and how it can be non-extractive. A lot of us know what we can and cannot say. Like I'll give you an example from my book. So the introduction chapter is written by only Muskogee people. I brought in someone who's a ceremonial person in our tribe, and I'm not going to say his position. He doesn't say his position anywhere in the introduction either, because it's a sovereign process that he has, or that a position that he has that no one needs to know about. But even when we're talking about the history of our people, I had to go and get permission to do that and work with specific people to do it in a good way. And so I guess the way that I'm trying to link this together with your question is that the best way to know what's extractive, what's not extractive, is to trust the person you're speaking to. And which again, I say always opt to speak to tribal governmental officials. But like most of us know how we're talking around things. Like I'm not going to tell specific things of our history in a way that I'm not supposed to. I'm never going to give away anything with traditional ecological knowledge. I can talk about how I make baskets. I'm not going to talk about the process of those, how I harvest them and stuff like that. And so if you're interviewing an Indigenous person and you think that they're skirting the surface of a topic, sometimes we're doing that very purposefully. So if you keep asking a follow-up question, that's not always respectful, right? So just know that sometimes when we're talking very broadly and generally, that's with purpose, and that's because of data sovereignty. I hope that answers your question, or some of them.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. James or Todd, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is James. I have some thoughts. Well, there's a reason why I brought up the Buffy St. Marie story. Again, exactly what Laura was saying about, who do you speak to? Who speak for a tribe? That's an important part. And I think you also need to understand that we're all different. Todd's different than me, and I'm different than Laura. Laura's different than me. And we all have different stories, different histories, different cultures. We still have them today. So you have to understand the diversity of your tribes and how they are different. What way work with one tribe would not work with another one. So you got to do your research. I will say that, you need to develop what I call tribal cultural intelligence, and you have to do your homework on that. And then that could be that to me, if you come to me for a story, if you want to interview a story, I'll ask you questions and see what you know as well. There has to be that relationship between the person and the tribe. That's a hard one, right? Because people don't have time for that. But I would say that's one of your should be one of your goals. Because if you come to me with that, then it tells me that you understand us or you're on the road to understanding. The other part I would say is to become really familiar with UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Again, that's another vetted document, a process that most Indigenous around the world adhere to or agree to as a starting point for engagement with Indigenous people, with their knowledge and who they are. So there's something called free and prior informed consent. I know that in my work, we have to fill papers out, right? We have to sign papers when we talk about things. And so most recently, I was asked to be part of a workshop in Alaska. It was the development of co-production of environmental knowledge. And this was in Alaska, right? So I was the only lower 48 guy there. They're all Alaska First Nation people and villages. And boy, that was really interesting to me. Just the 15 people that were in that room representing those nations were different. And I kept thinking, I think I'm tribally culturally intelligent. And yet when I went into that place, I went into that room with those people, I felt like I felt an outsider, if you will, because I was. They didn't know me, I didn't know them. And so I think, there's a lot of effort that has to go on in terms of your part getting ready for these things. You really have to check your motivation first and foremost. Why are you doing this in the first place? Is it to your question about extraction, right? So there are things that I think you'd be aware of, and I think you will. If you do those things in the right way from the beginning, you're more likely you can build that credibility within any country to do more work if that's what you want to do. That'd be my response. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. All right, moving on. I think Michelle is next up with questions.
Adam, can I say one follow-up? Because I just thought of something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but thinking back, Haley, to what you asked about like being respectful. One thing you can always do, one thing I always appreciate when journalists do with me is send the people the story and give them the ability to correct it if something got wrong. Give them the space to think about things before you publish. And if there's anything that needs to be changed, maybe they have to go talk to someone and make sure that what they said is something that they can say. But always give them some oversight. And that's another way to control for data sovereignty. So yeah.
Thanks, Laura. Michelle.
Hey, thanks. This is a question for both Laura and Todd. Laura, you talked about the paradigm shift toward co-equity based management and land back management. And I wonder if both you and Todd could reflect on where the Kukatali Preserve sits along that path and what specific circumstances or decisions could be emulated elsewhere.
Todd, if you go first, I can pull up something that I need to look for to help with this, to show something.
Sure. I think well, we've had our co-management group was probably the best group we could get together and work with, because I think we're coming from a place of a really strong co-management agreement, so that we were handed something or we were placed into something that already had a great framework. So that story I don't have yet of how it all came about. But I think, there's a lot of political background work that went into it. So that, the state parks and basically the Washington administrative and government, could work with our government in putting it together. So I think it needs to start from a place, really, really high up, and then have that approval and background and the want and need from, our political leaders to do it, so that when they, put together the co-management agreement, we had, specific 5 or 6 specific goals in mind that related to making it a preserve, maintaining the natural resources out there, but also making it publicly accessible. So I think, we were kind of handed, this great agreement on a, silver platter to say, here you go, and make it happen. It wasn't totally easy to make it happen, but we weren't in a place of like needing to determine how and what we needed to do. Just more of the, how do we work together to make this happen? Yeah, trying to emulate that elsewhere, starting with the political side of things to really have them work together to make it happen. Otherwise, then we didn't have to haggle about, what it meant to do it. We just had to go do it.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen real quick. Hold on. So I'm working on a paper. Actually, Todd's working on this paper with me too, and a bunch of other folks. And what we're trying to do here, so I presented this at Jackson Hole's intertribal gathering, something like that, a few weeks ago. But this is kind of a model when I think about co-management, when I think about different power structures for management, and it's an adaptation of an Indigenous academic from New Zealand's model that she had for, what was she using that for some other kind of process, but we've adapted it and we've changed some things on it. But so when we think about like colonial power structures, there's no tribal consultation. We have tribal consultation required, but does not need to be implemented. So it's happening to Indigenous peoples or for Indigenous peoples. When we start getting into the like paradigmatic shifts that I've been talking about, right now what the federal government's trying to do is they're trying to do collaborative management. And it's just talking to tribes. That's what it is. Okay. And that's with tribes, right? Where tribal consultation is required and Indigenous people's insights they're supposed to be implemented into managerial processes. We're not there yet, but this is the goal that the government's trying to get to. When I see what is happening with Swinomish tribe, which Todd has been talking about, and the state of Washington, it's actually where we're starting to move into this more positive power structure, because it's actual co-equity based management where they're sharing powers, where there's a lot of elevation of Indigenous leadership into the managerial process, where it's not just like a harvesting or extraction process every time the park needs to come to them and ask for something, because the tribe is in charge of things too. What land back is where we have Indigenous park management managed by Indigenous peoples, right? And that's not exactly where Swinomish tribe is at, because they're managing in this co-equity based framework. What I'm hoping at some point we can all get back to is where we're managing as Indigenous peoples, where we have land back, but it's also incorporated like into the whole fabric of how parks are managed. Everything about our Indigenous ways of being, where those just prevail as the management paradigm. Whereas land back could be something like braiding Western sciences with Indigenous knowledges, only by Indigenous peoples, right? But so I think that Todd is right here. I think that the Swinomish tribe is right here on this. Todd, would you agree with that assumption? And Todd and I haven't really talked about this, even though we're writing a paper about it in the background.
Yeah, no, I think that seems right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole scale, and then there's spectrums between this, and there are miles between with and beside, from collaborative to co-equity based. So yeah, that was a good question.
Thanks to you both, really helpful. I'm amazed you had a graphic
Yeah.
to answer my
that was the
question right
best
at hand.
answer,
Thank
so.
you.
All right. If I'm still in order here, I think Luan had a question for Todd.
Yes, and then anyone can answer, any of the speakers. Laura had mentioned federally and public parkland and how those often exclude Indigenous people using them. And so Todd has this example of his tribe managing this land. And I'm wondering what the conversations are as we move along the spectrum towards co-equity based management, on how to balance or navigate public use of lands versus tribal use of lands, and how those kind of the tension between the tribes needs and kind of traditional practices on the land versus inviting public into the spaces to use these lands.
Yeah, this is James. I'll take a first crack at that. It's a great question. Here in South Dakota, we've been working. There's a place called Devil's Tower in Wyoming as a starting example here, where certain times of the summertime, that place is a special place for the Lakota peoples, the Great Sioux Nation, but also other tribes for Sundance purposes or ceremonial. So for many years, we as tribes been negotiating with the park and recreational sector, to voluntarily, because we can't do it by legal means, but voluntarily at this point, to restrain or not to climb that place and for a certain part of the time of the summer. And that's taken a lot of work to get to that point where not only is it working to some degree, but also for the rock climbers and such to really understand, why that time needs to be for tribal people. I mentioned Wind Cave again. I think there is a conflict, right? There is inherent conflict with land and tribal people, and I think that always will exist. My question is, if something like climate change comes in and disrupts everything, then what are we going to do? And so we have to come together with a better agreement, a better paradigm where we are working together as federal government, tribes, and our local communities, just for the fact for the land. And all those things are on the land that we still need and require for our tribe and for our people. So I do think that that's important. I just put in a link a place, something that we're part of called the World Wilderness Congress. We're going to host that in the Black Hills. And if you know the story of the Black Hills in South Dakota, that's been a great point of contention for many years. The land was illegally taken. Even Supreme Court announced that it was, gross injustice. There's a whole bunch of money sitting someplace. I don't know, maybe it's in China. Multi-billion dollars now sitting there for the sale of the Black Hills, which we never accepted. And so I think, so now we're going to this Wilderness Congress, right? So we're bringing together people from around the world to the Black Hills this next summer, August 25th and 31st. And I think we're really going to see it begin to understand again, the status of how we are thinking about the land, everything that has been shared with land back, co-management, co-collaboration. Those things are certainly going to be discussed, but also I think, building those alliances, building those partnerships so that we can have better understanding. Those that live like in South Dakota, we just have this great conflict between the state of South Dakota and tribal nations. And I just don't see how that's ever going to be resolved when it comes to land. There's always going to be this inherent conflict between that, sort of the crux of everything there is. So that'd be my thoughts. Thank you.
To kind of footnote what James is saying, I write a lot about land back and these co-equity based management models, and I always get asked the same question at any time I speak. Well, what does that mean for the general public if tribes had their lands back, if they were the ones solely managing the lands? What does that look like in terms of access for the general public to those lands? And lots of people always ask, well, why don't you create a framework for how they manage their lands? That's always another question. And the only answer to that is tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty looks completely different, or tribal decisions look completely different from tribe to tribe, right? So the way that a tribe is going to manage their lands, or the ways that they might want people to access their lands, is going to look so subjective from people to people, from landscape to landscape, from community to community. And it's not for academics to create those methods for them. That's what tribal governments are for, right? To create the methods by which they're going to manage lands, by which they can determine if they want public access. There's some tribes, that might really be completely open to having the public there full time, just like national parks allow for these days. Whereas there might be other tribes that have restrictions that are like, we can only do things seasonally, like during our harvesting season. No, the general public can't come out here. No, you can't come and watch what we're doing. There may be tribes that are more generous and say that, if you'd like to learn from us, maybe you can learn our ways or something like that. Some tribes are really into that. That's more of the braiding thing, right? Whereas some tribes are very into data sovereignty, and they're like, we'll control this how we want, and we don't have to answer to the general public. So there's never going to be one pathway for how land back happens, for how management happens, for, if tribes actually ever get public lands into their domain of power and control, it'll be so super subjective. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for it, but because it depends on the community's needs and their desires and how they want to use their sovereignty to manage things.
All right. That was actually a great kind of final statement here of the session. I hate to cut things short, but we do need to take a half-hour break